Hello, my name's Colin Hyde, and this is a presentation called Walnut Street Past and Present. And I first put this together back in 1994 when I wrote a book about Walnut Street, which I think was called Walnut Street Past, Present and Future. And that was commissioned by Crash Arts because of the City Challenge scheme that was going on in the Walnut Street area back then, all those years ago. So I put together, and we collected photographs at the time. We went out and took more photographs. And in the 25 years since then, I've also added photographs of my own and from various sources. And I credit as many of the sources as I can on the very last slide. And I'll apologize in advance if there are some of your photos in there and I haven't credited you. Sorry. So there are a lot of photos to show you and only a limited amount of time. So I'm going to move quickly. And as this is being videoed, if you didn't quite see the photo long enough, you can always go back and have a look at the video and look at it. So, first slide. This is the area in the 1870s or 1880s before the canal was straightened. And the reason that the area around the Walnut Street to the north and south is as it is because the canal was straightened and the flooding in the area was controlled in the 1890s. What you're looking at here is a map that shows the Freemans lands, the Freemans common lands, and it's a disease map. So all the little red and black marks are incidences of tuberculosis, smallpox, things like that. And you can see that the area around the infirmary it has a lot of incidences and a lot of cases of this. This was a damp, wet, unhealthy area that had been developed from the 1860s onwards with terraced housing. But you could see that down towards the cattle market, the Brazil Street, Sorday Street area, and the continuation of Walnut Street over the canal hasn't yet been developed. So let's get on with the photographs. And this first photograph, I think, is from around the 1920s, and it shows the gas holders to the south of the area. You can see Filbert Street just to the left, the Tigers Ground at the top, and look at all the allotments on the right. Freeman's common allotments everywhere. There's the cricket ground is in the middle. The county used to play cricket, and a field where cooling towers ended up. And the power station was being developed in the middle of this photograph. So going on to the next one, there we see the cooling towers going up. And in the distance, you can see the War Memorial in Victoria Park and the counting house, which is still there, of course, on the cattle market. And this just gives you an idea of how some of these views have been changed through the trees growing up and tall buildings being put up. And of course, it wasn't that long before this that you could have been on Victoria Park and looked down into the city and had a good view of it. This is from the 1960s, and you can see things have changed a lot with the power station going in. That's coal for the power station, the cooling towers with the cricket ground just beneath them. The allotments beginning to change with Southfields College going in at the top right, and Filbert Street on the left as well. This is more what the area looked like for many people who lived in it, but of course the towers disappeared in the early 80s and the power station has gone and the new football stadium has been developed where the coal is, pretty much. And this is a really nice photograph of the allotments. Again, as you saw from the previous photographs, there were a lot of allotments. They were very well used. There were a bit of greenery for people who didn't have gardens, who lived in the red brick terraced houses. Someone once said that it was the longest bar in Leicester because you could take a pint out of the nearest pub and then walk into your allotment with your pint of beer. It looks very rural there, little rural lanes going down with hedgerows. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from the bottom of the area, from the south of the area, and move up Elston Road to the top, then go along to Montfort University and come right back down to the sports grounds again. So we're going to start on Elston Road. And this is the junction of Elston Road with Filbert Street East. This is an old nurse's home, and you can see if you look closely above the doorway, it still says nurse's home. And this is one of a lot of black and white photographs that I've sourced mostly from the County Record Office in Wigston. And people who lived in the area will remember Lapworth's, the tall building behind the bus, and the motorbike readers on the corner. Some of these photographs, there's almost a quiz. Where is it? What does it look like now? Well, that was the 60s. This was probably the 90s. You'll have to excuse me, but I've lost track of when I took a lot of these photos now. But you get the idea. That was the corner of Walnut Street with Elston Road. Moving up the road, on the left was what used to be called the Elston Street entrance. And this always puzzled me. I couldn't understand, why is it called the Elston Street entrance when it's clearly Elston Road? It's not Elston Street. Well, of course, that's because that was Elston Street at one point, and it was a road that went right across and out of the other side, as we will see on photographs coming up. And that's what that junction looks like now. And they've done away with the Elston Street signpost. And of course, the car park has gone up on the left as well. Okay, moving along, this is a really old photograph. You can see there's a tram there and the two pubs, the Freemans and the Bedford. We've got our back to what would be Granby Halls after the First World War. That was Granby Halls. It went up as a training hall the First World War, and of course for many people it became a basketball court, roller skating rink, venue for bands like Oasis and others. Basically a huge great area for sport and recreation that the city has never really replaced since it went. And that corner now looks like this, and we're still waiting for Tigers to build a hotel or something on top of the car park. The two pubs, this is gone now. This was the Freemans Hotel. It became the Physio and Firkin, and now it's been demolished. That was when it was the Physio and Firkin. This is actually Knighton Street, the Knighton Street entrance to the hospital, that's sometimes called. And we'll see that on an old map as we go along. And the Victory, the pub on the left became known as the Victory. That is closed. I always thought it was going to be demolished, but it hasn't been so far. And there is the only picture I found of Knighton Street. Obviously before the days of cars, before the days of road markings of litter, or almost before the days of people. And this is the view pretty much as it is today, although you can see the Firkin is still, Physio and Firkin is still up on the left. If this was a roundabout before this road system was put in, and there we can see the roundabout. Johnny Duncan, who was a manager of the football club, Leicester City Football Club, had was it a pub or a cafe just on the other side of the roundabout. We're not going to go up Welford Road. We're going to keep left and head up towards the front of the infirmary. This scene hasn't changed too much. This photo, I think, was from the 1990s. The multi-storey car park is still there. This, of course, required the demolition of quite a lot of small houses and shops. And when I was writing the book in the 90s, you could still see the letters complaining about compulsory purchase that had been kept on file. Goodness knows if they survive now. But a lot of little houses and businesses didn't want to be demolished, frankly. They were quite happy where they were, but they were compulsory purchased, as were a lot of other properties in the area. And you can read about that in the book. I went out and recorded the memories of a couple of dozen people, and they formed the bulk of the book. So going up and looking round, we can see back, turn back and see the original buildings of the infirmary. They're still there. This hasn't changed too dramatically in the last 20 years. And the corner, Infirmary Square, with the maternity wing of the infirmary there. And at the time, in '94, there was an Apple Centre and the Leicester Computer Centre on the corner there. This did change and has changed quite a bit. This is what was there before the maternity wing went up. And again, it was shops, mostly dating from the 1870s onwards, 1880s onwards. I do remember from one oral history, someone remembering that there was a house of ill repute on Infirmary Square, and you could often see American soldiers queuing first thing in the morning, although I think they thought they were queuing for a pint of milk or something at the time. And as with a lot of these black and white photographs, they were taken as the buildings were about to be demolished or were falling down. At that point, someone at the museum was told, oh, you better get out with a camera and record these. And hence you see a lot of them looking in really poor repair. So they do look like slums in these photographs. This is quite similar to what Oxford Street looks like now. The Swan and Rushes is still there. You'll notice up ahead on the right, a white timbered building, the Nag's Head and Star, that's gone. And there's a gate just by the tree to the De Montfort Housing Association flats, but that was the gate to Picards Factory. And they kept the gate, the entrance, to remind us of the factory being there. To the left, you can't quite see. Things have changed in the last 20 years. There's been some developments down there. And I really, really like this photograph from the 1950s or 60s, I think around about 1960. And you can see on the right, Picards Factory. And going slightly further down, there's the pub with Everard's on the side of it. And if you follow along the right, can you see that there's a big polar bear standing on top of a mint on the building? And that was Fox's Glacier Mint's factory. And that comes up in a couple of other photographs. And if you lived in the area and the wind was in the right direction, you got this smell of mint coming down the street. Notice as well the lack of road markings, the horse and cart, how small the cars were. And on the extreme left of the picture, we could just see a painting, ladies, not quite sure what it's going to say, but a reminder that there were a lot of clothing factories in the area. And we'll see more of these as we go along. And there is the block of flats and the gateway. That's all that's left of the factory. These were the buildings that replaced the pub. And as we move along, we can see in this photo, I think from the early 1960s, on the right, Fox's Glacier Mints. And next to that, the pub, the old bowling green, Copeland's the Builders, a little further along from there as well. On the left, you can see some advertising hoardings, and the buildings that we're about to see had been demolished there. There was a corner shop, some of the oldest buildings in the area. They'd been demolished, ready for new buildings to go in. And there is the blue plaque for Fox's Glacier Mints that is still there. They moved out to Braunston. So that's a more recent photograph. The Bowling Green pub is now dwarfed by the buildings around it. You see the Fox's Glacier Mints has gone. This is all student accommodation. Copeland's the Builders has gone. The Bowling Green always used to advertise itself as the oldest pub in Leicester, but talking to Mr. Copeland, the builder, who was next door, he said that in the 1950s, he did it up as an oldie worldy pub. So we're not completely convinced that the interior is genuine. It went through a couple of name changes. It did become the Polar Bear, which was great because that echoed Fox's Glacier Mints being next door to it. And now it's reverted back to its name of the Bowling Green. And of course, just a little bit further down is the Jain Temple. So any excuse to get a photo of this in the PowerPoint as well. And this is the corner as it comes down to De Montfort University and Newark Street. This is before the building on the corner was put in. And I really just put this in because it's got a nice advertisement for the twice nightly shows at the Palace. And look at the streets before they put tarmac down. Cobbled sets, sometimes bricks as the surface. And there are some nice photos taken around this area of people laying the road as well. Okay, onto an aerial photograph of this entire area. To get your bearings, we've got the canal at the bottom and Castle Gardens just on the left at the bottom. So if you go up over the Newark Bridge, you can find the Hawthorne building of De Montfort University with what was a barracks on the other side of it, military barracks. And can you just see the tops of all the buses? There was a bus station there going out to the magazine. To the right of the picture is street after street of red brick terraced housing. Bottom right, the chimney was an incinerator. But otherwise, what we're looking at is terraced housing, lots of it. Quite poor quality terraced housing. The terraced housing around De Montfort University was put up from the 1860s onwards, and bylaws making sure that the building quality was better. 2 bricks thick walls instead of 1. enough space for air and light to get in. They didn't come in until the mid-1870s with various public health acts. So most of the terraced housing that you see in Leicester to this day is after 1875 or thereabouts. So the older houses were of poor quality, and they are the ones that have been demolished. Whereas the surviving streets like Grasmere Street, they would all be 1875 and later because they're better quality and they were worth saving. The next photo is almost exactly the same as this, but taken in the 1970s when a lot of the housing had gone. And you can see a dramatic difference. The canal is still at the bottom. Almost all the housing has disappeared. This would have been the Polytechnic rather than Montfort University. It would have been Leicester Polytechnic at the time. And you can see there's a lot of open space waiting to be developed. At the top right-hand corner, there's the Royal Infirmary, and right at the top-hand corner is Granby Halls. And only Grasmere Street survives in this photograph. So a dramatic difference in really quite a short amount of time. And that's why when I did the book in the 90s, there was still this really vivid feeling that the community had been torn apart in a short space of time, which it had. This is a photograph. Any readers of the Leicester Mercury will have seen this many times. This is taken from the roof of the Hawthorne building, looking down towards Filbert Street when the cooling towers and the power station were still there. It looks like it was before the Clean Air Act, which I think was 1956. And this is mainly all the soot, all the smoke coming out of the individual chimneys. And you can see each house burnt fuel, and the smoke coming out contributed to smog. Leicester always had a reputation as a clean city because it didn't have heavy industry. So not chimneys belching out massive amount of dirt, but enough. And the air quality could be pretty awful. And the health authorities at the time were always putting on exhibitions about smog and the danger to your health from it. From 1994, that's the same view. And as you can see, it's dramatically different. Although this is 25 years ago, the campus of the university is still recognizable. There have been changes, but you can get the main parts of it there. Okay, Bonners Lane. A lot of people don't know that this is called Bonners Lane. It's pretty much opposite the Bowling Green pub. And you can see on the left, top left, it says Bonners Lane, and there's an arrow coming down to show you where it is. The Fox's Glacier Mints building is picked out by another arrow. And in the middle, just down and to the right, is a red zigzag. And locals told me that this alleyway was called the Twizzle and Twine. And this was a dogleg alleyway that went from Grange Lane through onto Oxford Street. And it was just still there when I went back and took some photos a few years ago. Just before we leave this, look in the bottom half of the picture at the way the buildings are crammed in. This was some of the poorest housing. You've got one room upon one room upon one room, or just one room on top of one room. You've got bakehouses, you've got shops, washrooms, toilets, really crammed in. Very difficult to get a sense of just how claustrophobic this was and how unsanitary and unhygienic it was as well. One of the oldest photographs of the area, looking at one of the old medieval walls of the town that went along Bonners Lane up until the beginning of the 20th century. That's why it was photographed. And on the other side of that, going along Bonners Lane, this is just the remnants of it. There's a date, 1914, on the posters. And there were some old buildings, some genuinely old buildings in the area. And in fact, the whole area was a Roman suburb. So there's certainly a lot of history to the area. But the remains of the wall disappeared at the beginning of the 20th century. This is the corner shop that was demolished in a previous photograph when we were looking at Fox's Glacier Mints, and I said the building on the left had been demolished. This is a really lovely photograph of the grocery shop on the corner. There it is. Look how narrow and almost medieval Bonners Lane is. And it only had to be narrow for horses and carts to get down. It wasn't built for motors of any sort. So very narrow, very dark. And there you can see it's starting to be demolished. This would be in the 1950s. Incidentally, if you go down the road, that's the Russell building at the very end. You can still use that in a lot of photographs to get your bearings. And that's what it looks like at the moment. The little shop would have been on the island in the middle, roughly where that person is crossing the road. So the scale has increased dramatically as well. Moving down Bonners Lane and turning left, we come onto Grange Lane. So we've come from the left and we've come down and we're looking down Grange Lane. This is a good example of one room on top of one room on top of one room. So you can see these aren't big places. We've got a nice oral history from a rent collector who I think in the 1930s went up into one of the top rooms, and the woman there said, "Look, you can see daylight, it's leaking." And he said he saw red stripes on the wallpaper and said, "Oh, have you been decorating?" She said, "No, those are the bugs that the children kill before they go to bed each night." So not a good area, a slum area that was well overdue the clearances of the 50s. This was from the 1990s. The Deacon Knitting Company Limited painted advertisement was there for a long time. Can you see the outline of the gable of the pub that used to be there as well? That's what it looks like now. So that red brick knitting factory has disappeared. But that's the pub. The Alderman Inn. It was Eagle Brewery, Leicester Brewing and Malt, LBM was very common. You'd see the Eagle Brewery and the LBM on all sorts of pubs all over the city. And the Deacon Knitting Company didn't have its advertisement up on the side of the building at this point. And there was the glass piano that the Alderman was well known for. I'm told the glass piano probably ended up in a retirement home in Great Yarmouth many years later. And this is the Twizzle and Twine as it was in about 2000, I think. No great shakes, but it did give you an idea of the claustrophobic nature of the area when it was all like this. And that's Oxford Street on the other side there. This is roughly what the area looks like today from the entrance to the Twizzle and Twine. That's Gosling Street ahead of us on the left. And those were the houses on Gosling Street before they were demolished. And again, you can see that they're in an awful state. That's another shot of the same buildings. Going up to the corner, on the right is the corner with Mill Lane. And this is what we're going to look at next. Okay, we're now looking at a map of the area around Mill Lane. Mill Lane runs across the bottom, mid-bottom of the map. To the top right, you can see the Magazine Square, Drill Hall, the Hawthorne, going to the left, the Tech and Art School, which is what the Hawthorne building was. And then Goswell Street, Grey Street, Middle Street. These are the oldest, smallest houses in the area. By the time we get to the 1950s, 1960s, a lot of them are falling apart. They're really not sanitary. They're very small and long overdue demolition. And I'm going to make this point several times as we go along. And you can see all the streets coming off them. The top part of the map is all De Montfort University now. Okay. And we're on the corner. Grange Lane is on the left. Looking down Mill Lane, this is straight into the De Montfort University campus with, I think, Fairfax Street on the right. And the corner shop on the right was the Sherwin Sisters Tripe shop. Enamel basins you would take in to get your tripe and take it home to Granny and Grandad or whoever was in your house. Look how narrow the street is and compare it with what it's like today. This was the 1990s. Cars were still allowed along there. It was still a through road. This was just before some major redevelopment. And we've leapt forward to what it looks like today. A dramatic change, as you can see. That's another view looking along Mill Lane down towards the Russell building at the bottom. And it's been pointed out to me, this would be the 1960s. All the English cars, a Triumph, a Mini, a Hillman. This changes as the years go on. So north side, Polytechnic, south side, shops and houses. And going along towards the canal, Morby and King were there, but that's being demolished. This was the 1990s. Those low-rise buildings were student accommodation. There was student accommodation right on the campus. The little buses were Fox Cubs, and I don't know why they did away with those. I always thought they were great. Now, of course, this has changed completely. This site is where the student accommodation was, and of course, one of the best venues in Leicester for live music and the Students' Union. Those of us of a certain age have very fond memories of seeing bands there. Great, great venue. But this is spectacular too. Some great new buildings that have been put up. Look, here's the canal on the bottom left. Now we're looking up Mill Lane. The bridge goes up and along, and there are all the rows of terraced houses with factories. And this is Mill Lane with the Queen's Building on the right, and this is before it was all pedestrianised. This is now, it's been landscaped and pedestrianised. It just looks very, very nice now. I think they've done a great job. And this was before anything had changed at all. This is a shot from the 1950s, before any redevelopment had happened, when it was just this narrow street going from Oxford Street right through to the canal. Then they wanted to redevelop it in the 1960s for the Polytechnic. And I really like this. This is the Newark Tavern, and you can just see this sign, good stabling for cattle, that's been revealed by demolishing the building next to it. Very nice. And this open space on the right, the car is pointing towards Oxford Street. So the Bowling Green pub would be at the end of the street there. This has now been cleared to put up new buildings for what would be Leicester Polytechnic. And we've got the canal behind us, and we're looking towards Oxford Street, and taken on the same day as some of the other photographs. And we've got all these Morris Minors parked, with the Polytechnic on the left. This was the 1990s, and this is where everyone says, well, hang on, all the cars are now German, Italian, or French, which they were in the 1990s. But again, still a through road, traffic still allowed through. Then slowly, over the course of the last 10 or 15 years, they've managed to get rid of the traffic from the area. And this photo's, of course, still now, this is out of date now, because it now looks like this. And it's a completely pedestrianised area. So dramatic changes in the last 60 years or so. This is unrecognisable from what it was before. Now we're going to do some of the streets running off Mill Lane, running north and south now. Gateway Street. This is the gateway now. This is, as you can see off Google Maps, looking up to the Newarks, with the Portland building, a former shoe factory in the centre there. There used to be some rather nice stucco buildings, houses leading along Gateway Street, and you can just see on the right, it says Portland Shoes. Quite a prestigious company. And there is one of the figures on the doorway leading into the Portland building. Looking back, down Gateway Street, on the left is the site of the current student union. That had been a building of the Stibby company, known as the Stibby's building. That was demolished and the new Students' Union building put up. That's the Infirmary ahead of us. And I'll just go back. Oopsie. Am I going to go back, or is it going to let me? Yeah, there we go. The building on the left there, it's still there. And that is the flatted factory project there. This was a big deal in Leicester at the time. It was the first building like this that had been built. So there was a lot of attention paid to it. The current Student Union building is middle left. That's the Stibby building that was demolished. And again, you get a sense of the backyards. You can see someone's got some washing out. And that's the Student Union building going up. Similar sort of angle. And there we are, all nicely finished. Whenever I do a walk around the area, I always take people past the former Harrison and Hayes factory. This is an early 20th century hosiery factory, and you'll notice it's not red brick. They've splashed out on this. If you ever get a chance to look at the detail, it's very good. And this is just a factory for making swimwear and things like that. And yet really a nice building. Glazed bricks. It was the Gateway pub at the time I took this photograph. And there were students living above it. And I think this is one of the first times that students used to complain about the noise being made by other people in the pub beneath them. I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but the building itself still survives. And it's a good example of how, as someone said in the oral histories I recorded, it was a good area to live, work and play. So you were in a terraced house, you grew up in a terraced house, you went to one of the local schools, and when you left school, there was a factory like Harrison and Hayes waiting for you. And you will find that young women, young girls who started in the factory would have their mother or their aunt or their sister also working in the same factory. And if there wasn't Harrison and Hayes, there were plenty of other ones that you could work in as well. This was the nature of these close-knit red brick terraced communities. And of course, there were plenty of pubs. At one point, there were 24 pubs in the area. This is one of the surviving pubs, the Sir Robert Peel. Still there, still hanging on. And we're going to go along Outram Street now, which runs parallel to Gateway Street. And sometimes you can only see the outline or the echo of a street. This is roughly where Outram Street ran. It was quite a long street, went along the side of the Queen's Building. And this aerial photograph, the red, the encircled bit is small one up, one down houses. Outram Street is just beneath them. Havelock Street is just above them. And this was also a feature of these densely packed areas. This was literally one room on top of one room. And in the 1950s, you might pay 50 pence a week rent, 10 shillings a week rent to live in there. Nice for starters was the phrase. If you were a young couple who didn't have any kids, you could move in there. It was cheap. You could afford it. But as soon as you had kids, you really wanted to get out because they were very small indeed. This is still Outram Street. It must have been a very slow day at the Leicester Mercury or the Leicester Evening News. And somehow this black arrow has got embedded in the roof of a house. And the reporter came out. It was a sagging roof. And everybody came out to see the sagging roof. You made your own fun in those days. Okay, Havelock Street was one of those ones running parallel. At Mill Lane, we've already seen the Newark Tavern before. Really nice looking pub. Again, LBM Ales, Leicester Brewing and Malt. Pulling back a bit, walking backwards, we can now see the Polytechnic at the top with the Sir Colin Campbell Inn on the right. And pulling back a bit more, the taller building on the left was Wright's Foundry. Very well known. They made a lot of lamp posts, and where was I? I was out in a village just on Leicester Ring Road in the churchyard, and for some reason, Wanlip. I was in Wanlip. And in the churchyard, there is a lamp, and on it, it says Wright's Foundry on the lamp. So you will still see things made in that building in Leicester if you look carefully. And this is Havelock Street now. And this is one of these examples where they built around the existing street plan. So you're walking up Havelock Street, which is, of course, now a car park for DMU. And the road on the right, that was where the Colin Campbell pub was. And the actual road layout is very, very similar. Sometimes it's easier to work with what you've got rather than do a sort of tabula rasa and start from scratch. Turning round and looking down towards the infirmary, this photo shows the mosaic of the spinners on the right. And there's a white building, the Senate Warehouse, which dates this because that's not there anymore. And we'll come back to this. Rydal Street and Ullswater Street are just to the right in the last photograph. And the reason I'm showing you these is not because they're of great interest, but because they have factories at the end of the street. And it's a cliche about these sorts of areas. You lived in your street and you had a factory at the end of the street. And indeed, they do. So there was always work, is the idea. That is a modern building looming over the others, and it's student accommodation. Coming back now, we're going to go along Jarham Street to Havelock Street. This is Jarram Street. You can just see St Andrew's Church ahead on the left. And it's a typical black and white photograph from the 50s or 60s. Not that many people, not that many cars. You won't see many markings on the road. Pretty clean. There was no fast food or anything to litter the streets with particularly. And I really like this because it's got the awnings coming out, and you really don't see this much anymore. If you go to Spinney Hill Park, I think Hartington Street, you can sometimes see that people have put awnings out on their shops there. Look at all the shops, by the way. This was another feature of these sorts of areas. There might have been a factory at the end of each street, lots of pubs. There were loads of shops. Remember, this is before refrigeration, so you shopped every day. You went out and got milk, meat on an almost daily basis because there weren't freezers, refrigerators for a lot of people. So that enables a lot of shops to keep going across the entire area. There is St Andrew's Church, really nice church. If you ever get the chance to go inside and have a look, very good brickwork. Gilbert Scott, the famous architect, one of many that he did or his practice did around the country. A good focal piece for the area as the suburbs, as suburbs expanded in the 1840s, 50s and 60s. The Church of England realised it needed to keep up with the nonconformists, so you get lots of new churches being built in the suburbs. And I like this one, it's nice. Okay, back to this view that we've seen before, where Havelock Street and Jarram Street meet. And I've pointed out there the former Regal Cinema. And this was quite a big deal at the time. In the 1930s, this was one of the newest cinema in Leicester at one point. This is an older photograph with the Prince Alfred on the left. And look, there's the cinema on the right. At the very end is another pub, which I think is the Gladstone. Oh, it is. There we go. The Gladstone Arms. I thought that, this looks like a really nice pub. And I was giving this talk many years ago. I said, what a nice looking pub. And someone stuck his hand up and said, that's my bedroom window. I lived in that pub. My mum and dad ran it. It was horrible. So, fair enough. Looks nice. And there is the Regal. Yes, as I said, at one point, the newest cinema in Leicester, and sadly, one of the very first to close as television started to take over and people's leisure habits changed in the 50s and 60s. As a Danny Kaye film, Merry Andrew, on, and that was taken. In 1960, most of the theatres in Leicester had closed, and there was a brief period when there was no theatre in Leicester. So there was a move to get a sort of arts theatre that eventually became the Phoenix. And the owner of the Regal, knowing that was happening, got these plans drawn up. And the idea was to have what became the Phoenix on this site. And that's what it would look like. Really nice, really good plans. The trouble was that the plans for the roads changed. Initially, Jarram Street was going to be a dual carriageway. So lots of people coming by. That changed. It remained a bit of a backwater. This never happened. The Regal closed quite early. It became a warehouse. And then, as is the way of things, it became a car park. And I think that's what it is at the moment, a car park. Lots of little streets, now part of the Royal Infirmary. Kent Street, Victoria, Albert and Crown. You can see where they're going with Victoria, Albert and Crown, can't you? This is an aerial shot. This is all underneath the infirmary now. I love this photograph because it shows, again, how all the buildings are crammed in. Can you see the washings out? I'm guessing that means it's probably a Monday because you put your washing out to dry on a Monday. If you put it out later in the week, people would notice and they might comment. Look at all the little houses and toilet blocks and wash houses crammed in there. And top right, you can just make out a tennis court on the infirmary. That stayed there for some time. Oh, it's a series of photographs that I'll go through quite quickly, showing the area as it was demolished. Notice the roads are still there. And if you walk where A&D used to be, under the bridge, which is just centre up and left a bit, you can still see that they used this essential road layout. So you can still walk along some of these streets. And these photographs used to be in the Infirmary Museum when the infirmary had a little museum. So at the top, all the buildings intact. In the middle, That area we've just looked at cleared. It always becomes a car park for a while. And at the bottom, you can see again further clearances. A new chimney's gone up. Even more of a car park. And at the bottom one, the entire area has been swept away, as you can see. So again, dramatic changes. Lots of housing coming down. And the Queen Victoria, that eventually disappeared. There were air raid shelters in the Second World War at the bottom of this. And another aerial shot. This also shows you disruption to the area around the infirmary as well. It wasn't just those streets that were swept away. The maternity unit went up, where the car park, multi-story car park was. That also was cleared away. So for quite a few years, quite a lot of disruption to the whole area. And we're now going to look at New Bridge Street and the Nut Streets. The red line is New Bridge Street that went from Infirmary Square all the way down to the cricket ground. And crisscrossing this, you had from the bottom up, Brazil, Sauday, Hazel, Filbert, Walnut, Chestnut, the Nut Streets. And to the right in the middle, Elston Street, Napier and Chestnut Street. That's where the car park, pretty much where the car park for the Royal Infirmary is now. Again, this was compulsory purchase. These houses were actually quite good. They could have been rescued along with other houses in later plans in the 70s and 80s, but they were wanted for the car park, so they were compulsory purchased and demolished. And as you can imagine, some people were not best pleased with that. So this was New Bridge Street, looking down towards the cooling towers. I think up until 1982, this area could define itself as the area by the cooling towers. On one of these crossroads, there were three out of the four corner shops were butchers. So again, New Bridge Street was well known for many, many shops up and down the length of it, as well as there being shops in all the other parts of the area as well. This is looking in the opposite direction from the last one. Here, the infirmary is starting, the larger buildings are starting to head down across Ayleston, Chestnut, Napier Street. There are two pubs there, the Rifle Butts, I think. Oh, the Lifeboy, I can't remember. They're about to be demolished. So all these streets, all these houses, pubs, shops are being demolished. You could look across these. I can't remember if this is Chestnut or Napier. That's Granby Halls at the far end. There's Granby Halls again. So this is the same view pretty much. That's the 1990s. And now, not only is Granby Halls gone, but you wouldn't be able to see it anyway because the new buildings have gone up. And this is going back a bit. Napier, Ayleston, Chestnut have been demolished and the infirmary is marching forwards. That's pretty much what it looks like today. Someone living on Walnut Street said when they demolished the houses, mice flew out in every which way direction. There's a lovely quote saying he had to get his broom and brush them all away. Cockroaches were what people told me about. Mice, yes, but mainly cockroaches. And there's a lovely quote from, I think, Victoria Street, of someone saying that when they got out for the day and they came back, her mother wouldn't go into the house until Dad had gone in and swept out the cockroaches. So not hygienic. And of course, I haven't mentioned outdoor toilets particularly, but that lady shared her house. 3 or 4 houses shared the same toilet. So outdoor toilets, cockroaches, not nice. New Bridge Street, the line of it today carries on over Walnut Street and heads down between what were originally flats for nurses. And it goes out the other side. This is looking south towards the cricket ground. And there's Hazel Street School. What was called a board school, B-O-A-R-D. A lot of these went up at the end of the 19th century as the state took over responsibility for educating children from the church. Really nice Queen Anne design for those who know that sort of thing. Big red brick, white sash windows, lots of light, lots of ventilation, modern education for boys and girls. And this photograph, I think, turned up on Facebook recently. I originally got this because it was pinned up in the staff room of Hazel Street School in 1994. And one of the people I interviewed is in the photograph, dancing around the maypole around about the outbreak of the Second World War, 1939, thereabouts. Lovely photograph. Saudet Street, notice the red brick terraced housing is fading away here. And Brazil Street. Now these have become villas. These are quite posh, and look, there are trees planted. So this is quite upmarket compared to the other streets. And I've thrown in a picture of Freeman's Common just to show where the allotments were. Actually, look, it says Safeway. This is before Morrison's took it over. These were the early days of the redevelopment of the Freeman's Common site. Okay, heading into the last part of the presentation now. These are photographs of Walnut Street itself. Although this was probably taken 10 or 15 years ago, it hasn't changed that much. This is the corner with Havelock Street with the Infirmary on your right. That's a picture from the 50s. On the right, the Welcome Cafe is remembered by a lot of people. I love the way these old photographs make the streets look like a free-for-all, because there's no paint on the roads to tell you where the middle of the road was or anything like that. There is the Welcome Cafe. And of course, where that was, St Andrews was built. St Andrews, a housing estate that was planned in the 1960s and went up in the late 60s, originally flat roofs, built so that people were separated from pedestrians, and you can see the walkways. Cars went at the bottom, people were up above. Initially worked quite well. People who moved in at the beginning loved the fact that there was hot water whenever you wanted it, whenever you needed it. Good modern dwellings. Suffered eventually in the 80s, got a very bad reputation as the older original residents moved out. And what happened was that in the car bays at the bottom, no one could see what was going on where the cars were parked. So it enabled people doing illegal things to do them down there where no one could see what was going on. It got a very bad reputation eventually, and the whole lot was demolished. And these were put up probably 20 years ago now. I've lost track of the time on this one. But here, the front doors open right onto the street. You're overlooking what's going on, and there's no place for people to engage in illegal activities, and it all seems much nicer. And a quick nod to Filmy Gardens, which is the little green. It's a triangular area. There's some sports facilities there now, and the green bit in the middle still survives. These are some photos. I can't remember where these came from. The black and white ones from the 50s and 60s show what was actually a paddling pool. There was water in there, a dog sitting on the side of it, and there was a park keeper's hut. And the park keeper back in the 50s would come out and chase you away if you were doing wrong things. By the time the 1980s had come along, it had gone downhill a bit. There was broken glass. The facilities weren't so good. So what we're seeing now is a nice redevelopment of the park with better facilities. It's cleaned up, looks much better. And here's a really nice, I think, 1920s photograph of the football ground. And top left, you can see that the Filmy Gardens was actually allotments for the First World War. And in the 1920s, it looks like they were still allotments. And here you can see why people in the houses around the football ground could watch the football from their windows and occasionally charge a couple of pennies for people to come and watch the game. And certainly everybody in the area would charge for people to store their bicycles in the alleyways. So if you lived next to the football ground, you could make a few pennies from bicycle storage. And this is a nice photo. I think this is Len Cook with the schoolboy there, with Don Revie behind him signing the autograph book. Always helps if you live near the football ground, you could grab the players on their way in and out. Another aerial photograph. The circle top left is where the St Andrews estate went, and you can see the little park just beneath it with that little square rectangular bit where the paddling pool was. The floodlights have gone up at the ground, and there's a car park there. Where the car park was, that used to be a field where sheep were kept. When I did the oral histories in 1994, there were still a couple of people who remembered going out there to gather sheep droppings and bring them back for their dad's allotments. Another shot, very similar, showing where the circle is. That's the St Andrews estate. Once it had gone up or was in the process of going up, that's it being built. And that is a photograph from just before the football ground was demolished. So that's the Carling stand, is the big white roof. And you can see there's a lot of people in there as well. So that was just before Filbert Street was demolished. And that's the area now. It's a bit of a wasteland and it's awaiting redevelopment. The student accommodation went up quite quickly initially, but nothing's happened. So there's this brownfield land just waiting for redevelopment at the moment. The new football ground, of course, looks very nice and makes for nice photographs from the canal. And I'm just, to finish off with, going to concentrate on a couple of buildings in the area. And this is one of the iconic buildings in the Walnut Street area. It's the Liberty Building, built in the 1920s. One of the only buildings like this in the country. I think there might have been only one other to this particular design, whose name is going to escape me for the moment. Very nice building with a Statue of Liberty on the top. The owners, this was Leonard's originally. The owners went to New York on a trip in the 20s, loved the Statue of Liberty and decided they wanted one on top of their building. So they had one made and there it stands. Now, it would have been nice if this building could have been turned into flats, but developers said it was too big and bulky in the interior to actually turn into flats, and it would be better to demolish it and put something else up, which was a huge pity because it was a nice building. The fact that they saved the statue really is neither here nor there. The building was a good one, and it's a pity it had to go. So it was in a poor state. It had been left, it was very run down. That is the absence of the Liberty Building. That's the building that replaced it. It's very functional, not nearly as nice. Student accommodation. That was the statue in a crate. We did worry about what was going to happen to it. That was on the car park of Filbert Street for a while. And now it's been put on a pedestal and is at the roundabout. And it's nice that it survived. I would have preferred it if the building had survived, but there you go. And it's still a landmark as you come into the city. You still, as you drive past, and say, we're home. It's the Liberty statue. That's the plaque. It's got a quote from Thomas Paine and says, the Upperton Road Viaduct redevelopment scheme was opened by the lead member for transport. I see no mention of the Liberty Factory. Very odd. Why would you not mention that? That's the reason it was made in the first place. I've never quite understood that, but there we go. However, the real landmark is this new building, the Summit, one of the tallest buildings in Leicester. It kind of dwarfs the Statue of Liberty now. But this is one of those landmarks as you come into Leicester from the south and turn towards the area. This is the thing you see. It's the new building. It's student accommodation again. And you get the theme of student accommodation coming through a lot of these more recent photographs. This is one of the code buildings. We saw the back of one of these in one of the shots earlier. And this kind of sums up the way the area has changed in the last 30, 40 years. This is something that in 1994, when I did the book, everyone was aware of. They knew the Infirmary wanted to expand. They knew Montfort University wanted to expand. So many people felt that the days of the community as it was were numbered. Now, it hasn't completely disappeared, but of course, student buildings, there are more student buildings than there used to be. There are students living in the community. So there's no doubt the nature of the community has changed dramatically over that long period of the last 40, 50, 60 years, but also quite a bit, even in the 25 years since I wrote the book and took a lot of these photographs. So to finish off with, we're just going to go back to the 50s and the 60s when the power station was still there. The mist and the fog on the canal, and the power station belched out warm water. So actually the canal was quite warm, and I am told made for good fishing. So here's a couple of photographs to finish off with of mist on the canal, people fishing, and the shadows of industry in the background. And I could have gone on a lot more about industry in Leicester, but that'll be another talk on another day. But you can see there factories, power stations, and the silhouette of the Liberty statue when it was on its rightful place at the top of the Liberty building. And that is the end of the talk. Thank you for sticking with me through so many photographs. The end.